Who are you, Mike? What do you do?
Who am I? I don't think we've got time for a full answer. My name's Mike Kane. I'm pastor of a church called Emmanuel that is here in Bristol.
Cool. Well, I'll let you
Can I dive in? Ooh, there we go. I don't know whether you read The Week. The Week is a kind of digest of the week's news. It's a sort of magazine type thing. And in it there is a column called Boring But Important. Yeah? This talk is going to be boring, but very important. Very important. Who chose the Gospels? Can we have a look at the first slide? These are the opening verses of Luke's Gospel. And he writes this: "Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught." Do you see what he's doing? He's gathered together eyewitness accounts. He's carefully investigated everything. He's checked to see if what they said stacks up, so that Theophilus, the guy he's writing to, may know the certainty of the things he's been taught. And we discover what he means is the things he's been taught about Jesus. He's saying, you can be certain that the things I am writing about Jesus, about the things he said and the things he did, are true. That the Jesus you meet in my gospel, Theophilus, is the real Jesus. Have a look at the next slide. In 2006, National Geographic magazine trumpeted the English publication of the Gospel of Judas. And I remember conversations with people at the time. They said, "Whoa, there's a Gospel of Judas? Like there are other Gospels?" Yeah, there's a Gospel of Peter and Mary and Thomas. There's a Gospel of Nicodemus. There's a Gospel of the Hebrews, a Gospel of the Egyptians. At home, I have a book about that thick with texts from about 40 other Gospels that are not in the New Testament. One writer speaks of the early sort of church being sort of swimming on a sea of multiple Gospels. And the very striking thing is that Jesus of these Gospels, Thomas and Judas and so on, is very different from the Gospel of Luke and Matthew and Mark and John, the Gospels you get in the New Testament. In Luke and Matthew and Mark and John, Jesus is not just another man, not just a religious teacher. He's the Son of God. He's unique. And he's come not just to teach us, but he's come to rescue us by dying on a cross. And those gospel writers say, and that's why we need him. But in the Gospel of Judas, Jesus laughs at his disciples. He laughs at their Jewish view of a creator God. In the Gospel of Judas, that Jesus says, it's all about the God within you. It's all about spiritual inner enlightenment. In the Gospel of Thomas, if you read it, you'll see there's not much real kind of narrative. There's nothing about Jesus' death or his resurrection. It's a kind of collection of sayings. Some of them do allude to teachings of Jesus in the New Testament Gospels. A lot of the material is very different. So in the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus is not uniquely the Son of God, come to rescue us by dying on the cross. He is a teacher of spiritual enlightenment. So here's an example of Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas. He says, "When you come to know yourselves, you will be known. You will understand you are children of the living Father. But if you will not know yourselves, then you are in poverty." Do you see? In Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the way to become children of God is to put your trust in the Son of God who died for you and rose again to save you. It's all about trusting him. In Thomas, see, the whole focus of those Gospels is him. In Thomas, the way to become children of God is to know yourself. See, the focus is on me, within. Now, when you read that, isn't that unsettling? I mean, which is the real Jesus? The Jesus of Luke or the Jesus of Thomas? And how come Luke's Jesus made it into the Bible and Thomas' Jesus didn't? Well, the story that's been doing the rounds is, well, of course, there's been a great cover-up. Up to the 4th century, so up to roughly the year 300, there's this sea of Gospels, loads of versions of Jesus, loads of versions of Christianity, all on an equal footing. And then, can we have the next slide? In 325, the Roman Emperor Constantine invited a load of bishops to a council in Nicaea. And all these men in pointy hats sat around and they decided what the official version of Christianity was going to be. So Dan Brown's account of this in the Da Vinci Code is, Sophie asks, who chose which Gospels to include? Aha, Teabing burst in with enthusiasm. The fundamental irony of Christianity. The Bible, as we know it today, was collated by the pagan Roman Emperor Constantine the Great. See, the story goes, Constantine wanted to unite his empire, and so what he did is he imposed one version of Christianity. And because he was emperor, he wanted to control people. So don't give them the Jesus who is all about inner enlightenment. Don't give them the one who says, look within you and you too can become a god. That is a dangerous idea. Don't give them the Jesus of the Gospel of Thomas. Give them the Jesus of the Gospel of Luke. Give them the one about Jesus who is the Son of God. The one who says you can't save yourself. You need me to rescue you. See, that'll keep them in their place. That's the one we'll go for. And so the story goes, it's Constantine who decides Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are in, and then he bans and burns all the others. And it's only now that we're discovering more and more of these ancient Gospels, and they are rocking all that we ever thought about Jesus. That's the story a lot of people have heard. The only trouble is that story is a myth. Questions about which books should go into the Bible were not talked about at the Council of Nicaea. You can read the minutes. But the myth has a kind of hold on us because it tells a story of people in power suppressing freedom. And we love a conspiracy story. You say, okay, but why? Why the Gospel of Luke and not the Gospel of Thomas? Somewhere along the line, someone made a choice. Someone said the real Jesus is the Jesus of Luke, Matthew, Mark, and John, not the Jesus of Thomas. What if they made the wrong choice? What if the truth was suppressed? Well, the first thing to say is we have always known about other gospel-like books from the fact that the writers of the 2nd and 3rd century refer to them. And over the years, we've found more and more ancient copies of these ancient Gospels. Have a look at the next slide. This is a place in Egypt called Nag Hammadi. In 1945, a whole stack of Gospel writings were found. And over time, scholars have built up a collection of these manuscripts. Some of them are Christian writings from within the New Testament. Some are sort of Christian-seeming writings from outside the New Testament. And scholars date these manuscripts. They do it by looking at the papyrus that they're written on, the kind of ink that's used, the style of the writing. Most of them are from the sort of mid-2nd to 3rd century. That's not necessarily when they're originally written. That's just the age of the copies we found. And we've got copies of John's Gospel. Have a look here. Here's a picture of John's Gospel. I don't know whether that is John's Gospel. Yeah, that's John's. It is. There it is. That was from the mid-2nd century. We've got a copy of the Gospel of Matthew coming up. There we are, a little fragment of the Gospel of Matthew. And here's a fragment of the Gospel of, next one, Mary. Gospel of Mary? What? That's from the mid-3rd century. And what people do is they put all the fragments together and they say, do you see how many manuscripts we've got and how many Gospels didn't make it into the New Testament? And so that seems to tell the story. In early Christianity, all kinds of ideas were floating around on a sea of Gospels. And all those Gospels were equally valid. It could just as easily be in the Gospel of Thomas that went mainstream. It's just that somebody made a choice. The two problems with thinking like that is, first of all, when we add up all the texts we've got from the 2nd and 3rd century, the number of text from New Testament Gospels do in fact outnumber the number from non-New Testament Gospels. So yes, there are lots of these ancient manuscripts going around, but the fact that there are more copies of the 4 that are in the New Testament than all the others put together, does that begin to suggest that they were at least somehow mainstream, in more demand, well before a council decided to vote for them allegedly in the 4th century. The truth is numbers are not always that helpful because we're always finding more. What we've got is not so much evidence of what there actually was as evidence of what we found. And the fact that so many of these non-New Testament Gospels were found in Egypt kind of skews the numbers. Let me put it like this. My hero is the Irish writer Samuel Beckett. I have everything he ever wrote, all his plays, all his novels, all his poems, some of his critical essays. I've got a couple of biographies on him. I've got about, I think, nearly 15 books about him. Now, let's just sort of imagine that in some kind of freak accident, all the libraries and bookshelves of everyone in Bristol are destroyed, except for mine, okay? My bookshelves make it through this kind of apocalyptic scenario. And in hundreds of years' time, archaeologists find my bookshelves. And they do the maths. And they work out that I have more books on Samuel Beckett than anyone else. And they come to the conclusion that the most popular writer in Bristol in 2016 was Samuel Beckett. What would you think of that conclusion? You'd say, well, it was a little bit skewed by the fact that only this weird guy who's into Samuel Beckett's library survived. Well, that's the thing. That's the thing, is the fact that so many of these books were found at Nag Hammadi kind of skews the thing, because Nag Hammadi in Egypt was a place that was into a religious movement called Gnosticism, which is a 2nd century, that's from 100 onwards movement, and it's all about, you guessed it, enlightenment through knowledge of yourself. And do you see what they're doing? They are using the figure of Jesus to promote their Gnostic beliefs. So the fact that we find lots of Gnostic versions of Jesus in Egypt doesn't necessarily mean everyone all around the world was into these sorts of Gospels, that this was the authentic one. One of the clues we have as to what everyone was into is looking at how manuscripts were bound together. So by the 3rd century, have a look at the next slide, sheets of papyrus were bound together in these things called codices. These look like books, I suppose. And whenever you get Gospels bound together in these books, you don't get Matthew, Mark, Luke, and, Judas, or Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Thomas. Wherever you get multiple Gospels bound together, you always get Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Could that mean, way before some council sat in the 4th century, those were the 4 that were seen as special in some way? Another clue is to look at the size of the manuscripts. If they're big, it means they were made for public reading. And most of the New Testament Gospel manuscripts we found from the 3rd century are big. There is one early copy of the Gospel of Thomas that's big enough for public reading, but most of the non-New Testament Gospels are small. In other words, they were around for private reading, but they weren't particularly published to be read in the sort of official, formal church gatherings. So why were these 4 the ones that were designed to be read publicly? And we have accounts of people writing about how these were read in the gatherings. Why were these 4 read and not the others? Could it be because they, well before the 4th century, they were the ones that were mainstream? In fact, what's the next slide? Do we have a next slide? I can't remember. Yes, there we go. In fact, in 226, a guy called Origen of Alexandria talked about how the church has 4 Gospels. Then he rather cheerfully added, heretics have many. You see, whatever you think of his kind of snippiness, he's saying the church has 4 in 226. Tertullian says, he's writing in 207 to 212, says, of the apostles, therefore, John and Matthew first instilled faith into us, whilst of apostolic men, Luke and Mark renew it afterwards. Notice 4 Gospels. A guy called Hippolytus is writing in 202. He's writing a commentary on an Old Testament book, but just in passing, he says, Christ is preached in the world through the 4-fold gospel. So he's not even trying to argue the case. He just assumes that the gospel is a 4-fold thing. So do you see this whole idea that all the Gospels were equally valid until the men in pointy hats decided which should be official in the 4th century? That isn't what the research tells us. You get writers at the start of the 3rd century talking about 4 Gospels. To which some people go, yeah, well, we know why that is. That is all because of this fellow. Next slide, please. Irenaeus. Irenaeus was the bishop of Lyon in France. And we are now traveling back in time from the 3rd century to the, 4th century, 3rd century, to the end of the 2nd century. And in 180, have we got a slide for this? I think we have. Yeah, next slide. 180, this is what Irenaeus wrote. He wrote a book called Against Heresies, another cheerful sounding volume. But he wrote, "It is not possible that the Gospels can be either more or fewer in number than they are. For since there are 4 zones of the world in which we live, and 4 principal winds, while the church is scattered through the world, it is fitting that the church should have 4 pillars. He who was manifested to men has given us the gospel under 4 aspects, bound together by one Spirit." Okay? And people go, well, there you go. He's the one. It's Irenaeus. He's the one who made the choice. He's the first person to establish what these 4 gospels were. He's the truth suppressor. Only, what do you make of his argument about the 4 winds? It's not very good, is it? I mean, it's not a very good argument. There must be 4 gospels. There must be, because there are 4 winds. I mean, can you imagine anyone who is a big fan of the Gospel of Thomas going, oh, all right then, 4 winds, 4 gospels, throw Thomas away. The point is, it's not a very good argument, because he's not having to make the argument. He's not saying, get rid of all the other gospels, because there can only be 4, because there are only 4 winds. He's not saying that. He's just saying, as there are 4 winds, there are 4 gospels. It is fitting. See, he's not trying to persuade them. He's just saying, what is the case? And he's not the only 4 gospel man at the end of the 2nd century. Next slide, you get this guy, Clement of Alexandria. Just look at some of the numbers that in his writings he refers to Matthew 757 times, or sections from Luke's gospel 402 times, and so on. So a total of 1,672 references to chunks in the New Testament gospels, as opposed to 14 allusions or references to non-New Testament gospels. And even when he cites them, it's because he's disagreeing with them. We haven't quite got time for this. There's another guy, there's a guy called Serapion, who there's a dispute about the Gospel of Peter, and he says, no, we're not to read the Gospel of Peter in the public gathering because it's not one of the authentic ones. So he's at least got an idea of there being authentic Gospels. I think we've got a slide for this. The Muratorian fragment, yeah, there's a piece of fun. It's a piece of ancient text, and it's from the 2nd century, and it's interesting because there's a section that's missing. But the bit that's left is really tantalizing. It goes, missing. The 3rd book of the gospel is that according to Luke, the well-known physician. The 4th of the gospels is that of John, one of the disciples. See? So although the first bit of the text is missing, he's clearly going, there's a first, there's a second, there's a third, and there's a 4th. Now, of course, we don't know for sure what the first and the second were, but at the very least, you see, he's stopping at the number 4. He's got a sense of there being 4. So, before the 4th century, there was a sea of gospels. No, that's not what the research shows us. Look at this map. There is a map, and what it's saying is towards the end of the 2nd century, you've got people all across the Roman Empire, and they're all agreeing that there are 4 gospels. You've got Irenaeus in France, you've got the Muratorian fragment in Rome, you've got, in Antioch, you've got Serapion and his friend Theophilus, and in Alexandria in Egypt, you've got Clement. What's so interesting about this is at that time, the church had no centralized leadership. There was no council that decreed 4 gospels. These were the 4 that people just held up all across the Roman Empire. Why? We'll come back to that. We can go further back. We're going back in time. We can go back to the 170s when a fellow called Tatian, who was a Syrian, did a harmony of the gospels. He wanted to weave all the gospels together as one. Which gospels did he harmonize? The clue is he called it the diatessaron. Diatessaron means through the 4. So in other words, he's thinking if you're going to pull everything together, then it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that you need to pull together. And we can go even further back. And we're moving back to the mid-2nd century. We've gone from 170 to about 150. And there's a fellow called Justin who's about to appear on your screen. Oh, sorry, that was the diatessaron. You have the fun of seeing that, and there's Justin. I say the fun of seeing that, but you know what I mean. Justin wrote his book, and he wrote some books called The Apologies, which always to me sound like sort of English books. I'm so sorry. They're books that are apologetic in the sense that they are a defense of the Christian faith, and he writes them to the secular authorities. And he defends the Christian faith using material that he calls the memoirs of the apostles. He's trying to explain to the emperor what this stuff is. And he basically calls them gospels, which are memoirs of the apostles. Well, which gospels does he have in view? He never cites chapter and verse, but he uses phrases from Matthew and Luke. He talks about Jesus changing Peter's name from Simon to Peter, something you only get in Mark's gospel. There's no other piece of writing that includes that bit. And here's a section from John's gospel coming up on your screen. And in the middle of it, you see in yellow, Jesus is talking to this guy, Nicodemus, and he says, look, very truly, I tell you, no one can see the kingdom of God unless they are born again. And at one point, Justin says, except ye be reborn, ye shall not enter the kingdom of heaven. Where's he got that from? Well, it's like he's got John's gospel open in front of him. There's no other gospel in the New Testament or outside of the New Testament that uses language like this. And what's interesting to me, again, in his argument with the Roman emperor, he urges him to look into our writings, which are called gospels, he says. And he's assuming the emperor could get hold of a copy of the gospel. The emperor could kind of go down to Waterstones and buy himself a copy of these gospels. And he doesn't say, oh, when you go into Waterstones, you've got to be really careful because there's a whole sea of gospels. And it's just these particular four I'm talking about. Don't get confused. He just says, go and look into our gospels. And he's confident that the emperor will understand he means Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Let's pull this together a little bit. It's striking, to me at least, that by the mid-2nd century, 150-ish, when people are talking about the Christian faith, they're not talking about loads of different versions. They're talking about one version, the version represented in the four Gospels of the New Testament. And we can push back even earlier. Ignatius, who was a bishop in Syria, he was killed for being a Christian in 108 AD. On his way to being killed, he wrote off a series of letters. And he refers to Paul's letters quite a bit, and he refers to various incidents and sayings that you find in the New Testament Gospels. And it's really clear that the Jesus he speaks of is not the Jesus of Thomas or Judas, not the teacher of enlightenment, but the one you recognize from the four Gospels. Let me just read one thing that Ignatius says, although this is tiny print, and I'm not as young as I was. Here we go. He goes, as for me, my spirit is now all humble devotion to the cross which so greatly offends the unbelievers, but is salvation and eternal life to us. Now that is really striking because the Jesus he is passionate about is the Jesus whose death on the cross is the key to salvation. Do you see? Now the cross never features in the Gospel of Thomas or Judas. See, the Jesus he is passionate about is the Jesus of the New Testament Gospels. You get a similar thing in Clement, who was Bishop of Rome. He's writing in AD 96, even earlier. And again, the Jesus he talks about is not the teacher of enlightenment. He quotes another New Testament book, the book of Hebrews, and he talks about Jesus as the unique Son of God sitting on the throne of the universe. So never mind the 4th century, that's when they sorted it all out. In AD 96, when Christians talk about Jesus, they talk about the Jesus of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the Jesus who was not just a teacher of inner enlightenment, but the unique Son of God who came to rescue us by dying on a cross. You say, but why? Why those Gospels? Why are those the ones that the first Christians are always going on about? My grandfather was killed in the Second World War just before my dad was born. And a few years ago, my dad wanted to find out about his father. Who did he want to speak to? He wanted to speak to the people who knew him. He tracked down his father's squadron. He went to their reunion. He met with them. And he grilled them about his father. And he grilled them about the circumstances of his father's death because they were there. They saw. They remembered. You see? When something matters to you like that, you want to know the truth. You want to talk to the people who can give you the truth. And that's the impulse of the first Christians. See, the claims about Jesus were huge. The stakes were so high. They don't just go, oh, do you know, I think I've forgotten some really fun slides. Sorry, I do. I've missed the fun slide. Just move on to that's the fun slide of Ignatius. He's about to be eaten by that lion. There we go. Anyway, but the point is relevant because the stakes are so high. If you say you're going to follow Jesus, they could throw you to the lions for it. And you need to know whether it's worth getting thrown to the lions for. That you need to know, is there anyone who can give us the truth? Are there any eyewitnesses who can verify this? And that's why they looked to the apostles, to the people who were with Jesus. And they asked, have the apostles left any evidence for us? And in the 2nd century, you remember Irenaeus? Next slide, please. The Four Winds guy. He did actually make an argument for there being 4 Gospels, but it was nothing to do with 4 winds. It was the fact that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were all connected to Jesus and the circle of Jesus' first followers. See, it's because of their links with the apostles that the Gospels became so important. Matthew was one of the disciples. Mark was the interpreter of Peter. In other words, Peter, one of the disciples, spoke in Aramaic. Mark wrote it up in Greek for the non-Jews to read. Luke wrote down what he got from the Apostle Paul. John, he says, leaned on the breast of Jesus. He was one of Jesus' closest friends. You see, that's why they focus on Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, because these are the documents that come from the apostles, the circle of people who knew Jesus firsthand and are able to tell us the truth. But where do you get this idea from? These books were from the apostles. Well, one strand to follow is Irenaeus, the Four Winds guy. He was writing in 180. He was taught by a guy called Polycarp. And listen to what Irenaeus says about Polycarp. He says, I remember the events of these days more clearly than those which happened recently. For what we learn as children grows up with the soul and is united to it, so that I can speak even of the place in which the blessed Polycarp sat and disputed, how he came in and went out, the character of his life, the appearance of his body, the discourses which he made to people, how he reported his intercourse with John and with others who had seen the Lord, how he remembered their words, and what were the things concerning the Lord which he heard from them, and about their miracles, and about their teaching, and how Polycarp had received them from the eyewitnesses of the word of life. Now, do you see what Irenaeus is saying? Polycarp was born in AD 70, died in 100. So in his kind of 20s and 30s, sorry, did I say he died in 100? No. Polycarp was born in AD 70, he died in 156. But John, the Apostle John, died in AD 100. But in his 20s and 30s, Polycarp was hanging out with John and these others who'd been with Jesus. So where did Irenaeus get these ideas from about who wrote the Gospels? He got them from Polycarp. Where did Polycarp get his ideas from? Oh, he got them from John, one of Jesus' disciples. And there are other strands like that. So the question is, who chose the Gospels? It's not that in the 4th century or the 3rd century, or even the 2nd century, people sat down and said, now, which Jesus should we go for? Which are the Gospels that we really like, you know? The claims about Jesus were massive. He's not just another teacher. He's the unique Son of God. The stakes are high. If you followed him, they could throw you to the lions. You need to know the truth. And as news of Jesus spread throughout the world, each new country, each new generation asked, where do we get to the truth? We need to be certain. So they go to the accounts that come from those who are with Jesus. Now, I'm nearly landing, because you might be thinking, hold on. Thomas? Peter? Mary? Weren't they apostles? Well, most scholars agree that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written somewhere between 60 and 90. The apostles, they wrote up the teachings of Jesus before they died so that they could pass it on. But these non-canonical Gospels, Thomas and Judas and so on, are written in the 2nd century. In other words, the Gospel of Thomas may claim to be by Thomas, but it was written about 100 years after Thomas was dead. In fact, it was not written by anyone who had eyewitness contact with Jesus. Now, there's not time for a full case here. I'm just going to give you 2 ideas to close as to why scholars think that. why they think that the New Testament Gospels are eyewitness accounts. The non-New Testament Gospels are kind of written in the 2nd century, much later, by people who had no contact with Jesus. And I want to imagine you are writing a story set 100 years ago in France. And you need to pass it off as an authentic eyewitness account. Okay? What are the biggest challenges going to be? You're writing this story. You need to get the names right, yeah? See, what were French people called 100 years ago? You can't just call everyone Pierre or Marie-Claude. You know, what other names did they have that were typical of the time? You need to get the details of the villages right. You need to know the route people took from one place to another. You need to know the names of the local mayor and the baker. Right, now think of doing that in the 2nd century. No Wikipedia, no period dramas. There are books, but the books are about great battles and great emperors and great cities. They're not really about village life. It's hard. How do you write an authentic account? And the point is, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John pass the authenticity test. When people appear in the narrative, they are named with the sort of names that people would have had. For example, the most common name at the time of Jesus in Palestine was Simon. The most common name in the Gospels is Simon. And that's why whenever you meet a Simon in the Gospels, you get a qualifier. Simon of Cyrene, Simon the leper, Simon the zealot. Because it's which Simon? There are so many of them. Whereas Bartholomew, just Bartholomew. There's not many Bartholomews. As in the writers of the Gospels, they know that. How do they know that? Whereas in Gospels like Thomas and Judas, you get the names of Judas and Mary and Jesus. And then you get a load of names like Barbelo and Yobel and Nabal and Sacklus. In other words, you get Egyptian names, which is a clue that the authors are at home in the world of Egyptian thinking, but they don't really know much about 1st century Palestine. And we could say similar things about place names and those kinds of things. Let me properly land. People say the Gospels are all written years after Jesus by people who didn't really know what happened. It's legend. That's true of the Gospels of Thomas and Judas and Mary and Philip. See, they don't include the sort of eyewitness detail that you'd expect from eyewitnesses who are there. They don't pass the authenticity test. They're legendary. But Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John do pass the authenticity test. And the reason that's important is because a lot of people think Jesus started as a good man, a teacher of spiritual enlightenment, and then over time the church added all this legendary material about his being the Son of God, who came to rescue us by dying on a cross, who rose from the dead. And what we need to do is we need to get back to the real Jesus, the original Jesus, who was just a spiritual teacher. And if that's what you think, then you're thinking, well, actually, I'm not that into spiritual teaching, so I'm not really that into Jesus. It's not really very relevant. I can understand that. But you need to know the earliest evidence, the earliest writings we have about Jesus is they have him as the Son of God. It's the later traditions, the Gnostic stuff, that has him as a teacher of enlightenment. So to go back to the original Jesus, the authentic Jesus, is to go back to the one who is uniquely the Son of God. And it seems to me if he's a spiritual teacher, if that's all he is, very easy to ignore. But we have credible evidence that he was a man like no other man who ever lived. He healed the sick. He calmed storms. He raised the dead. He said he was the Son of God. He said that in his love he had come to lay down his life for us, to rescue us, to restore us to the relationship with God that we were made for the life with him that starts now and lasts forever. And some people say, well, that sounds great, but you just can't really know anything about him for sure, can you? I mean, if you see one thing today, do you see how much we can know for sure? Do you see how certain we can be? The stakes are very high. It's not just Christians who need to be certain. If you're not a Christian, you think Jesus is just a spiritual teacher, you need to be certain. The stakes are very high. Why not pick up a gospel, like the ones that are scattered on the table here? There's a copy of the Gospel of Luke and a copy of the Gospel of John. Why don't you pick one up, take one home, read it for yourself, and see where it takes you. I'm going to stop there.